All right, we are almost done. We're getting close to getting to what I've been trying to build up to of making great renderings. Um, but one of the last pieces is getting into topography because that's definitely a key piece to really making the project look like it's supposed to in its environment. Though we don't get into too much crazy topography here in Florida, but we definitely get into some. And really, these techniques can be used for micro topography or macro topography. You know, really, they can get in anywhere. So I'm going to start with some basics in how to create topography, or if you get the lines or whatever. There's really three ways that I've seen topography come in from engineers. Um, Usually, this is the pretty typical way that in CAD plans, we'll just get 2D lines of the topography, and they'll be labeled at, you know, like uh, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, whatever the increments are. If you're lucky enough, I've gotten some engineering drawings where they've come in already at their proper heights. That's really nice because that's even less work. And I've actually gotten, I guess, what's called like pin topography, where they have vertical lines that show um, the height of a particular point. And really, in 2D, what you'll see is, say, right here, there'll be, say, an X, and there'll be a number located next to it. So really, at that point, you know, it's up 20 feet, and there'll be another X. So you'll get some of those where you'll just get X's throughout the property, and they'll have labels next to it. Uh, and so even if you just get those X's, it's a little time consuming, but you can come in here and say, okay, this one's at 360, this X is at 240, and you go in and you can just draw all the lines real quick. And you would eventually end up with something that looks like this. Uh, and so uh, this set of topography is just something I quickly created here in SketchUp. It's not anything real. Uh, but what I wanted to show is that you can essentially make the same exact topography no matter what you get. Um, and we can actually build all of them at the same time. If they ever come in like this, I just draw a box around it and make your faces. And then from there, you just extrude up to the heights that it's supposed to be at. Like I think I'm doing these at 10-foot increments. So you can actually even just do 10 foot and then do, you guys know on the push pull, if you double click, it does whatever the previous amount was, if that makes sense. So if I do 10 feet, if I double click, it does another 10. So on each one of these, I can just keep clicking until I get to the next step. This one I'm going to do as an innie. Why is this one not push pulling? That's weird. I don't know why that happened, but let's see here. Just going to get rid of that. There we go. I'm just going to pull this up, then go another 10 feet, and pull this up another 10. Actually, pull this up another 10. And if you have these lines, you know, like we talked about before with arches or arcs or circles, all it ever is just segmented lines to create arches. Sometimes they come out smooth, sometimes they don't. It's really not a big deal. You can always just open up your smooth panel. Let's see, where is it? The soften edges, and you can just usually just find a degree in which they all disappear. But again, it's really not that big of a deal because we're not really even going to use this this grouping, if you will. It's almost like if you remember back in design class and having to build cardboard topography, and that's pretty much what this is. Yes. Yeah, if you want to unsmooth something, it's the exact same thing. So here, if I select everything, I can just take my smooth tool and go all the way back to 0. or to whatever degree I want to. So that's how you can unsmooth it. Let's see here. So from here, it's really going to be the exact same process. If you don't have them open already, we've talked about them quite a few times, but if you right-click anywhere here on the gray, you should see something called Sandbox, and we're going to use the Sandbox tools. There's a couple other plugins we'll talk about that do it slightly different, and I'll explain the differences. But Sandbox tools is the native one, and that's the one that is definitely the quickest, and if you need to do something on the fly, it's a good version. Each one has their pros and cons, but again, we'll discuss it. So here, I don't want to select everything because I don't want these lines to be incorporated into my calculation. So I'm actually just going to delete this out. So it really is just this shell of the topography, if you see what I'm looking at. So this way, if I select everything, and then on my Sandbox tools, this first one right here, from contours, this is what we're going to use. So it's going to calculate all these contours, and it's basically going to create what's called a TIN network, TIN, which is just a triangulated irregular network. And for all intents and purposes, all it's going to do is just start creating triangles wherever it can, very much like that, and it's going to fill in these gaps, but it's going to kind of do it more on the fly, and you'll see that in a second. So if I click it, you see that it just created the network. Actually, I'm going to undo. Just like I want to get rid of this side here, I need to get rid of this side. And in fact, before I do it, you'll see why I'm going to do it. I'll click this again and run it. You see it creates this shell. But you see right here, it created this very odd network. I'm going to turn my hidden geometry on just so you can see a little better. It created this really weird output, and that's because it was trying to calculate those additional lines that really didn't have anything to do with the contours. So I'm going to undo that, get rid of this, and now I'm going to select everything and run it again. And you see it's much nicer. So with my hidden geometry on, you can basically see exactly what I talked about, that it just creates whatever triangles it could. And that's why it's called a TIN network. And it makes it into its own group, which is nice. So I'm actually just going to delete out this underneath piece, and you see we're left with this topography. Now, just like before when we talked about arcs, I'm just going to draw one real quick. If everybody remembers when we talked about these, way up here under segments, we have 12. We can change it from 12 to 96, and it smooths out the arc. So whenever you bring in contours, it's going to do the same thing. It'll have a preset segment number for these contours, and the lower the number, the more jagged your contour and topography is going to be. So you can see, like, just from a scale perspective, this grouping, this is almost 7 feet across, which is a pretty big number, I guess, depending on what you're looking at and what you're actually modeling. But when we're talking about residential scale stuff, that's probably a pretty big number that in reality you'd probably want to come back in and somehow adjust the number of segments. And if we have time, I have some plugins that talk about how to do that, that you can add segments in. So anyway, that will help smooth out your contour if you needed to. And so there I just unsmoothed it. You see I'm at 0 degrees. And so I can start jumping it up until it starts looking a little smoother. And a lot of times in this doing contour type of stuff, I'll usually turn on soften coplanar, and it just makes it a little bit nicer looking of a topography. And then from there, going back to our materials talk last week, remember if I try to paint this, this is going to be my grass is going to be all over the place. In fact, let me go back and paint it with brick. And you can remember the brick is all over the place. It's all following each individual triangle. But if we turn this texture back into a projected texture and then come back and paint this topography, you see that the grass actually lines up really nice. So that's just an application of one of the things we talked about last week, applying it to this model here. Now, moving on to this version, this is the exact same thing, except they're just two-dimensional lines, but they're in space. And it's going to do the exact same thing we just did, but here's a good example. Let me see. I can't change the segments here. Have to look up what plugin it does to change it. I've done it many times, but I'll show you that later. But you can see right now it just has 22 segments to it, which is pretty low. Something like this, I'd probably go 96 or 128 or something like that, just to make it a little bit smoother. But that's irrelevant to what we're talking about now. Again, the process is going to be the same, whatever the segments are. So here, I'm just going to select all the lines, and again, we'll run the Sandbox tool. And there you go. It created the same topography. Now this one did it a little bit smoother, and the reason being is, let me rebuild this real quick. There we go. Even getting rid of the side pieces that we talked about, what's still going to happen in doing it this way is we are selecting these edges. You can see this, the actual steps that's occurring, and in here you can see that this is where the step would have been. And so it's adding those lines into its calculation. You can see that. Doing it with just the lines, instead of trying to add this into its calculation, it's simply just going straight from here to here. And that's what's happening right here. So it gives you a little bit of a smoother contour. And again, choosing our projected texture, painting it on, you can see it looks much nicer. And this should give me the exact same result as what we did here, because it's really just going to take these individual points and try and connect everything. So again, using our Sandbox tools from contours, there we go. This one doesn't have this particular, let me hide this line, because this line was at 0, so there was no dots for it. So I guess you could really add those back in, add it, say, a foot, and then lower it back down or whatever. But for all intents and purposes, this pretty much is the same contour. Actually, no, it did a little bit different. So each one, you can see each one is slightly different. Oh, I know why. This one had a different height to it. So anyway, there's you can see the 3 ways that you can create contours. This is probably the easiest and most effective, drawing the contour lines and putting them in place where you want them, and then using the Sandbox tools. Another one I really like to use is this soap skin bubble, but where this one does not require a closed loop. The Sandbox tools, excuse me, does not require a closed loop. You can see these are all open-ended, and infers where the edges are. Soapskin bubble requires a single closed loop, meaning you wouldn't be able to do multiple contours. At least I don't think. Let me check. So now I'm closing the loop. I'm just going to deal with these real quick inside its own group. So again, if I click here on the Sandbox tools, let me make a quick copy of this. You can see it creates the approximation. And one of the things to be aware of with Sandbox tools that sometimes is good and sometimes is not. You see it created this line from here to here, where if I go back to my actual contours, I didn't have anything there. So I don't necessarily want that. In some instances I may. But it's easy enough to do because if I turn my hidden geometry on and edit this group, you can see that I can just quickly come in and erase out that extra geometry that it added in. And when we get into some actual examples, you'll see where that could become an issue. But again, it's just more something to be aware of how the plugin works. So there you go. So there's a true contour. Here, I don't think this is going to work, but let's see if it proves me wrong. Yeah, see, it's saying you must select 3 or more edges in a closed loop. So I need to do a single closed loop. So what I'm going to do is I'll make another copy of this. And this is why you wouldn't necessarily use this for creating topography, but we'll be using it to update topography, and you'll see that in an example in a minute. But from here, I can create soapskin bubble. And here, you see it's not trying to connect these dots. It's just filling in this loop. You can see it's overlaying a grid. And right down here, this division is a 10 by 10 grid. And you can just, before I enter into the, tell the command to do its job, I can change the division. So I can go 20, 30. I'd definitely be careful of getting too high, because just like anything else, if you have too many divisions, it's going to start taking a really long time to calculate. I typically stay around 20, depending on the complexity of what I'm doing. You know, if it's not as complex, maybe I'll jump to 30. But once I enter in my divisions, I'm going to drop this back down to 20. I'm going to hit enter, and you'll see that it's now going to create a calculation of this. And it's going to fill in all the edges. And then you'll see it kind of blows up with air. And this creates what's called a mesh network, a quad mesh network, that everything has 4 sides instead of 3. And it creates a little bit of a smoother approximation of your topography. So it takes longer, and it uses more resources, but it definitely creates a nicer, smoother topography. And if you really want to take the time, you can go through, each one of these, run the command. And you can see it doesn't take too long on most of this stuff. It's only if you get to super complex stuff that it really starts becoming an issue. But you can see then you can start stacking them onto each other. Maybe I'll group this together and explode it, and then smooth it all out together. And so you see it creates a really nice smooth network here. So that's soapskin bubble. And I really use that more when we get into dealing with the actual topography of working with a house. And we're going to get into our actual project in just a minute and show you really how I use soapskin bubble. Another one that I've played with, but I don't use a ton yet, is this, what's this one called? TopoShaper. And this one, it's kind of a mix between the Sandbox tools and the soap bubble, in that it creates a quad mesh instead of a tin network. But I believe it does it the same way that Sandbox does. I believe I can just select these here and map it out. Yeah, so you can see it created a really nice smooth map here, um, based on everything. And I know there's certain things you can do. I haven't really dove into this one a whole lot, but uh, while you're still in the terrain, I believe there's certain things you can do to edit it and really change it, smooth it out, um, flatten hilltops, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot more in here that I haven't really used yet, but it is a really, really nice one. And then I can say create terrain. Um, and there it is. Uh, I believe TopoShaper. Uh, yeah, TopoShaper. This one is, I did on all the other plugins, so let me make sure I show you the right ones. Let's see here, TopoShaper. I believe this is TomTom, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's Frito 6. And I don't think it's on the extension warehouse, but I do have it on the server, which if you, to install anything from the server, you would go inside of Extension Manager and then install extensions, and then under the SketchUp folder, which I believe is the M SketchUp library. In fact, let me sub mine. Let me do yours. M library SketchUp, and then plugins. And let's see here. Here it is right here, TopoShaper. And then you would just double click on this and it will install it. And I believe Soap Bubble is the same. Let me see. I can't remember if that one is on the warehouse or not. I don't think it used to be, but I think it is now. God bless you. For SketchUp plugins. Yeah, I think it's on the. I'm pretty sure it's on the extension warehouse now. Just to know, TopoShaper, you would need to have these Frito tools installed as well. I'm sorry, not Frito tools. libfrito 6. Actually, install them both anyway. And you probably already have them installed with other plugins you've done. But this Frito tools and this libfrito 6, I think you need to have both of them installed, or at least one or the other. I forget which. And let me just see if Soap Bubble's on here. I don't remember. Soap Skin Bubble. Yeah, it's this one right here by Joseph L. This is the one that you would want installed, and that's this Soap Bubble. What's interesting, just so you know, is it's free, but you can only install it for a year, and after a year you have to reinstall it. It's free to keep reinstalling it, but I think he does that to force reinstalls to make sure you're using the most current updated one. Again, just something to be aware of. And I'm pretty sure that when you run TopoShaper, you can specify what colors these things are. But it's nice because it does create almost a solid for you. I mean, they're their own group, so you'd have to explode them and make a solid, and it just paints them this color, so you can actually come in and paint it, say a black. And even using our material replacer that we talked about, I'm going to say replace this light green with grass. And then, let me see here. Didn't like that, but either way, I'm going to do this and just paint it. And so you can see you can just change the material. There you go. And so really this TopoShaper is one that I have not explored a whole lot, but I've started getting into it a little bit lately, and it really creates some nice stuff. And then from there, once you have the topography, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just so you know, these other ones, like the smooth tool, it's going to take a second to activate. All right, so here it is. Let me try this again. Let me not select that. not even the one I wanted, which is even funnier. Let's see here, which one do I want? No, no. Yeah, it actually was the one I want. Okay, good. So without the mesh selected, so I don't have anything selected, I'm going to click on this smooth tool. And you see it creates this radius. And down here, it's my preset at least is 30, and I think it's whatever it was used last. But the bigger the radius, obviously, the bigger the circle. So I'm actually going to jump this up to 50 feet. And you see that it got a little bigger. And what this will do, see if I can get down a little lower, is it's going to find all of the vertices within this 50-foot radius. And when I click and start pulling up, you can see these dark yellow vertices all the way out to these light yellow ones. And what that means is the bigger the vertice on this representation, the higher the vertice will lift. So it does it, you know, just a different, I don't even know what to call it, almost exponentially, I guess is what you can call it, that the closer to the center, the higher it will lift it. And same thing that you can go down, and it'll do the same thing, that the closer to the center, the lower it'll push it. So on something like this, you can see it's a little jagged, and so maybe you can start kind of smoothing some of these things out, even jumping down to a much lower radius. And so you can start getting into editing the topography very microly, you know, or much bigger. I don't use this one a whole lot, but it's just more of letting you know of what's available and what's there and how you can use this stuff if you needed to. I mean, it's pretty cool, like the way you can create topography with this. So anyway, so that's topography. Creating like a basic topography based off of lines and all that kind of stuff. So before we jump into dealing with an actual project, any other questions on creating the basics of topography? All right, so I'm going to jump to our wonderful old house. And all I have in here is, let me go to the CAD file. This is the outline of the house right here. And all I did was create a basic driveway and walkway and pool deck just to have something in here. And I'm sure you've seen them. In fact, here's a project I'm working on right now. If I go to the site plan, you know, this is pretty typical right here, where we'll have some sort of driveway design, some sort of pool design, and I'll just do a quick outline and bring those in. So that's essentially what I'm doing right here. It just did a much more basic form, but again, the idea is the same. And so doing my site plan before we get into topography, but talking about site plans, the way that I typically would deal with this stuff, in fact, I just want to pull this out just a little bit more to the end of my driveway, is I'll come in here and grab, say, my driveway, my walkway, and then I'll go to my grass layer. Drop those in, and I'm just going to close this off. So now I have these planes that I'm actually going to copy them and then erase out the grass. And this is one of those items where thinking ahead of what I want to do versus what I need to do. You don't need to cut out the grass. You can leave this all here and then build on top of it, and it's fine inside the SketchUp model. But where you can start running into a problem is, again, when we get into renderings, specifically Lumion. If there's grass, it basically makes the grass grow. And if there's grass underneath the driveway and you make the grass tall enough, it'll start popping up through the driveway. And so we don't want that. So I try to really trim out where grass is not supposed to be. So I'll do that, come back in here, say make this a group, and I'm going to repaint this back to my default mode. Double clicking my pathway, I'm going to hit Control G to make that a group, and then double clicking my driveway, make that a group. And on a basic level, if you're trying to get this done quick, you know, you do this, you add in your pavers, you know, maybe this one's a brick pathway, you know, whatever. Change the brick. If you really want to get fancy, you can cut this one and then rotate the brick 90 degrees. So there's your, you know, quick driveway. But in reality, the driveway actually ramps up. And so I'm going to pull just this line up to the bottom of my garage. But now I have this open air piece that's a little weird. And this is where my soap bubble comes in, that I like. Because now if I draw a line, say from here to here, and I'm just going to make this thing pretty simple, just this little triangle, if you see that. So it's this little kind of ramp. So again, that's even just a quick way you can do it, and then paint this with grass or whatever, and there you go. If you can use the any of the other apps we looked at, that can make it even nicer or whatever, but there's not a huge need for it. It's just something, just again, just to make it a little bit nicer. And this is just one of those little touches that just makes it, again, a little bit more realistic. It's not necessarily needed or required, but it just, whenever I get the chance, I like to add just additional details in. I'm actually going to redo this because I want to bring, give thickness to this walkway. And bring this down to there. And then paint it with my brick. I'm not going to worry about. I want to turn you and match you to you. There we go. That looks better. And then, since I built all this stuff out of solids, I want to be able to cut my porch, cut my walkway off at the porch. This is saying missing a surface. I have an extra surface border, and missing right there. So we'll close that up. There we go. Now it's a solid, and now I can delete that out. And there we have that. I'm just going to get rid of these. I just need the pool now. And so there we have a pathway that goes right up to our front porch. And similar to talking about the grass, I don't want grass underneath my house, so I'm just selecting the underneath piece, and I can paste this in here and delete out that. So now that's exactly where my house sits on, which leaves me with one more piece. And in fact, if I wanted to, I can actually pull this up a little bit to there. And this is actually going to be a good place to use the the soapskin bubble, because you see that it's not a true flat area because of the way that this driveway slopes. So I'm going to delete out the inner piece to this and leave just the outline, because now using my move command, grabbing the vertice, I can move these pieces to exactly where they need to be. So, because I can move lines much easier, but this is now no longer coplanar, so I can't simply turn this into a face anymore. If I wanted to, I could probably come in here and say, you know, try and find the triangles, and there you go. But I want to make this a little nicer. So now that I have a closed loop here, I'm going to run my soapskin bubble. I don't need this to be very detailed, so I'm going to leave this at a 10. I'm going to hit enter to run it. And it's going to just do its quick little calculation, and it's going to make a nice smooth topography that's going to fill that little gap in. And I'm just going to smooth it out a little bit. There we go. And paint it with grass. So now you can see that I have the grass slopes down and meets everything exactly. And I'm going to show you some more examples of this in a minute. But now you see that we have this nice little raised bed of grass that happens over here. Yeah, exactly. These are, you know, so to answer the question of, you know, if and when would we do this level of detail, you're exactly right. This would either be last minute or in general if you have time. Because if you don't have time, don't worry about it, because at the end of the day, we're architects and we're trying to show the house. The better we can show the house off, that's what we're aiming for, especially if knowing that the goal is to get into renderings, then you really do want to do this stuff because it really makes a big difference. But if we're doing client presentations, then you really don't necessarily want to worry about it. Just having, you know, going back to where this was all just essentially flat 2D stuff representing where the driveway and where the walkways would be, that's all you really need to worry about. That's your goal. Beyond that, if you have time and availability to do more, then these I'm showing you the methods in which you can do more. And again, especially getting into renderings. One instance that I've had where there's certain things where you really do have to do. In fact, there's a job I'm doing where the house is actually raised up. I think it's like 6.5 feet. You know, it's something like this. But the ground is pretty low, so we really needed to show it. And so I'm actually going to, let me just draw something like this. So I'm going to draw a square, or a rectangle, excuse me. I'll make that a group. And say this, my grass right now, say is the actual grass, but we had to raise the house up, and we need to show all of the sloping that would occur. And so now I'm going to come in to the house, and again, I'm going to grab the underneath side simply because this is going to give me an outline. So I'm going to copy that and then come back into here and paste. I don't care about any of these faces. Oops. I just need the outlines. And now I'm going to move this up, just up, say, 6 inches. And I'm going to draw my driveway in. So say that's the slope of the driveway we're going to deal with. So I'm going to bring this back to there. And if you don't know where I'm going with this yet, ultimately we're trying to create a closed loop for our soapskin bubble to use. Now, and the driveway is a nice breaking point, because if I didn't do it, and I go back to this, let me draw this back in. So I have this. just like before when I tried to do the double set of contours with Soapskin, this is going to see it as two different closed loops and will say it won't work. So if I click on Soapskin, it's just going to do the one, not the both, because I don't care about this. I want connect from here to here. So I'm going to escape out of this and delete all this. And so now by adding my driveway in, this is essentially open air, if you will. And now inside of here, this is where I want my grass to occur. So if I select all of this and use my Soapskin, and I'm just going to leave it at 10 just because I don't want it to calculate for too long. I'm glad I only did 10, not 20. And you know, there you go. There's your much nicer topography, just that simple. Now again, if I had a walkway built in, so you can see that I can add as many levels from a linear layer, linear perspective as I want, and that'll really help me create the look I'm going for. In fact, undo all this. Because really, just to do one more, you know, say I'm going to do something like this, where, what do I want to do? You know, I'm trying to get it so that this doesn't drop off, like, because right now it was basically creating a wall, and if I don't want that wall, I'm just going to say pull this out here. So I'm going to do something like that. And I'm going to grab this guy, add him in, this up to there. And so you can see that this is actually now going to be its own closed loop. So I'm just going to leave that there. And now I'm going to select this, and then we'll add that in a second point. I won't do too many of these because I don't want to get too involved in all this. I'm going to drop it down to 5 to, again, to make it a little quicker. So now this is adding in the pathway, and we'll see if it does my driveway, if I did my driveway right. Yeah, it looks like it's going to be a little nicer now. So again, you can, if you imagine that we did a 10 or a 20 division, it'll come out even nicer. But now it's built up for where my path will be, and this one really I can just come in here and use my from contours on the Sandbox tools. But again, here's an example where I don't want this to connect those dots. So editing this, I'm going to turn my hidden layer or hidden geometry on and just start deleting out the stuff that I don't need. And there you go. And I'm not going to get too involved in this, but so there you go. So there would be my pathway, my driveway would be pulled up, and there you go. Paint that green. So again, you can smooth this out and spend even more time making it nice, but just like that, you can build these topographies that really work with your model. And in my mind, you're really creating these outlines. You're no longer having to deal with actual faces, which is really the difficult part in creating topography. You're just creating these outlines of saying, you know what, I know I want this line to be at this height and I want this line to be at this height. And you're letting the computer create the geometry between the two. Um, yeah, so that's that. Let me put everything back down. And so this is just going to be another one of those where it's a lot of information and it's just going to come from actually getting in and using it and seeing how it all goes together. But really the key to me in learning any program is understanding that a program can or can't do something. Even if you don't remember how, it's the remembering that it can do it that really becomes a big piece. Um, and just like we did the driveway, it's pretty much going to be the same with creating the pool and the deck area. So I turned this into a group and copied it. I'm going to come to my grass layer. Oop, maybe I didn't copy it. Actually, I'm going to cut it out and paste, explode, and I'm going to delete all this. So I'm cutting out the grass of where my patio is going to go. And then I'm going to paste in my patio. And this is actually going to become my pool. So I'm going to cut that piece out. And maybe we'll pull this up 6 inches. And just for the sake of it, it's an ugly paper pattern, but we'll use it for now. You know, there's my patio. And I just pasted back in my pool. Actually, I want to do that. Yeah, okay. I want to. I like keeping the pool and the driveway and all that stuff inside of what I call this earth box. Just a good way for me to group it. So I just pasted this square back in, which is the outline of my pool. And so from here, I'm actually going to offset this 8 inches. Delete. I'm going to drop it. I usually go down 6 feet. Oops. And then offset in 8. And this way I can make the pool depth 5 feet. And it's just numbers I use. Again, we're not designing the pool. It just gives a nice number to it. So then my pool is sitting underneath my patio. Again, you can design pools 100 different ways. And just for reference, I do have this. These are pools I've used in projects. Again, this is in that same SketchUp block library that we have. This is block site pools. These are actually made as components if you needed to use them that way. So you see that it actually cuts out the grass. So if I were to copy, say, this one and plop it right on my grass, you see it cuts out the grass. So it's built like a window component kind of thing. But once I have the pool built, I'm going to copy the bottom, Control C, and then turn this into a group and paste in place that bottom piece. And we'll bring this up and we will paint it with water. And there's my pool. I can't remember if using a pool that actually cuts the grass if bringing it into Lumion would still work or not. I don't quite remember because I've always just cut out pools instead of using them as cut out components. But anyway, there you go. And if this was, say, Oceanside, here's a quick thing you can do. Just draw a quick arc. And I'm going to copy this from here to here. You know, most of the time we deal with seawalls, I guess, and you can draw the seawall in and all that. I mean, there's just a million different ways that we could deal with how, you know, what the actual site is. But for the fun of it, I'm just going to draw this in. And I can't remember if I've ever showed this plugin. I don't use it a ton, but it's such a great one. This one is called, what's it called? PushLine. I don't know if it's actually in the store anymore. Yeah, here it is. This a DBO PushLine by Dennis B. It's really nice. The same way that using the push-pull command will push and pull a face, this guy created this plugin that you can push-pull a line. If you see that, which is really nice. So now I can push-pull this curve all the way to here. And so you can see it just create that face. And I'm just going to add this into here. Oops. So there you go. So this way, if you ever had any water or something, some deep ocean, you can create, you know, some sort of semblance of the way it goes. But again, you know, there's 100 different ways, 100 different versions of beaches and water we've dealt with. But so it really depends on your site plan. So yeah, so it's 1 o'clock. The next thing on site plans that I was going to show is adding in vegetation and how I do it and the thought process behind it. I don't know if you guys want to take an additional 10 minutes and look at that real quick, or do that in another class. Yeah, no, we can do it in another class because we can spend a little bit more time on it, and as well as go over a couple other things on site stuff. So that's not a big deal at all. Yeah. Yeah, no, I get it. So again, there's a lot of information, and hopefully, I don't know if you guys start to see how you could use some of the stuff in your projects right now, or if you have any additional questions. Um, just know that, you know, topography really is actually not as difficult as I think it once was, or at least it what used to be for me. That once you start thinking about you can deal with topography and lines versus faces, it really started making things a lot easier for me. Um, so yeah, I mean, as always, whether you got questions now or as you're working on this stuff, if you got questions, feel free to call in. We can walk through some stuff. You got it. All right. Bye, guys.